A millionaire hires a fake wife to trick his sick grandfather and get his inheritance. Was he ready for what would happen next? Before we start the story, comment below which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Everyone. Dylan Langford wasn't the kind of man who made concessions. With a planned look on his face and a controlled smile, he ran his businesses firmly. He built a financial empire without ever needing anyone's advice or support. However, that morning, he found himself in an unexpected situation. Dylan was about to inherit his grandfather George's estate. Dylan was very sick. He spoke with his grandfather's lawyer and learned about a very important condition in the will. The lawyer said, "Your grandfather wants you to inherit. There's a condition." Dylan frowned. He was surprised. He thought his grandfather would simply leave him the fortune and properties without any problems. After all, he was the only heir. "Mr. George wants you to get married," the lawyer said. "Only after a formal marriage can you receive the entire inheritance." The idea sounded strange to Dylan. He was not going to get married. It made no sense. He never cared about being with someone for a long time. Dylan had never been in a serious relationship. He never had time to dedicate to anyone. "Does the marriage need to be legally recognized?" he asked, sounding upset. "Yes. It's a requirement of the will. It needs to happen before your grandfather passes away so he can bless it. It's a matter of honor for him," said the lawyer. Dylan sighed, feeling cornered. George always valued true love and family unity. Dylan considered that an outdated ideal. To him, marriage was just an unnecessary formality. A distraction. The rest of the day, Dylan thought hard about the idea of marriage. He didn't like the idea. It didn't fit with who he was. But he needed the money from his grandfather's will to grow his business. He also didn't want his grandfather to be waiting for this last request when he died. The next day, after a bad night of sleep, Dylan decided he needed a practical solution. He wanted to find a way to fulfill the requirement without getting too involved. While driving through the streets of Miami that morning, Dylan thought about how to do this. Transform your thoughts into action. Dylan stopped at the cafe he always went to for a coffee and a chance to clear his head. He saw Grace, the cafe owner, putting up a closed sign with a sad face. Dylan went up to her and asked, "Are you closing permanently?" Grace turned to him, surprised. Her eyes showed a mix of exhaustion and sadness. "Yes. I have no choice. I can't pay the bills anymore. The cafe was my dream. It seems like it's over." She looked down, clearly trying to control her emotions. Dylan didn't say anything for a moment. He started to think. Although he didn't know her well, he had talked with her a few times during his visits to the cafe. She might be the right person for his plan. "Grace. What if I told you there's a way to keep the cafe open?" He watched her closely, looking for any sign of interest. Grace raised her eyes, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I need something. You need money. Maybe we can help each other." Grace's expression became even more intrigued. Dylan just kept his steady gaze. He had a plan. Grace might be. Dylan knew he had to act fast. The idea he had wasn't common. It wouldn't be easy to accept. He needed to do it quickly. He could solve his problems and save Grace's dream with this deal. "Grace. I'm going to ask you something that might seem strange. Before you answer, I want you to think about the possibilities." She raised her eyebrows. Intrigued. Kept her eyes, she looked at him as if she was waiting for him to share a big secret. I'm listening, she said. Crossing her arms. I need a wife, he said suddenly. He watched her reaction. Grace blinked. Surprised. She laughed a little before she looked confused. Sorry. I must have misunderstood. You heard right, he confirmed. My grandfather says I need to get married to receive the family inheritance. Without that, everything I've built and all my plans will fall apart. It's his requirement. I need to fulfill it. I'm not talking about a real marriage. He hurried to clarify. Seeing her stunned expression. It would be an agreement. Something temporary. Grace shook her head, trying to absorb what she had just heard. You want to marry me to get an inheritance? Basically, yes. I know it sounds crazy. It's a simple contract. It's a union that would solve both our problems at once. In return, I'd pay you enough to clear your debts and keep the cafe running. She crossed her arms, clearly weighing the idea. Dylan could. She was thinking about it. Maybe she was even interested. She was still unsure. What would happen after the marriage ended? Grace asked. Her voice stronger than he expected. Once my grandfather dies, we can cancel the marriage. Everything would be done quickly and secretly. You wouldn't need to get involved. It would be just business. He promised her, trying to make the proposal as professional as possible. Grace looked at the cafe, her eyes showing all the hard work and sacrifices she had made. He knew the offer tempted her, as the chance to save her dream was tempting. Dylan also knew she was a person of strong beliefs. Accepting something so impersonal and planned was against everything that seemed important to her. This feels surreal, she said, looking at him thoughtfully. But what you're proposing? The offer tempted her, as it would save her dream. Dylan also knew she was a person of strong principles and values. Accepting something so impersonal and calculated went against everything that seemed important to her. This feels surreal, she said, looking at him thoughtfully. But what you're proposing would solve my problems. Dylan nodded, seeing that she was at least open to the idea. It's a trade, Grace said. You help me. I help you. Nothing more than that. A moment. Silence hung between them. Grace seemed lost in thought, probably imagining the implications of accepting a contract marriage. He hoped she would see it as he did. This would solve my problems. Dylan nodded, seeing that she was at least open to the idea. It's a trade. Grace. You help me. I'll help you. Nothing more than that. A moment. Silence hung between them. Grace seemed lost in thought, probably imagining the implications of accepting a contract marriage. He hoped she would see it as he did, a mutually beneficial deal. Finally, she looked up and, with a slight sigh, asked, if I say yes, how will this work? Dylan felt a mix of relief and triumph. He was closer than he thought to solving the dilemma. If you agree, I'll take care of all the details. It'll be discreet. No one needs to know. Just think about what this means. With the deal would be good for both of us. Finally, she looked up and, with a slight sigh, asked, if I say yes, how will this work? Dylan felt a mix of relief and triumph. He was closer than he thought to solving the dilemma. If you agree, I'll take care of all the details. It'll be discreet. No one needs to know. Just think about what this means. With the money, you can not only keep the cafe open, also expand it. Grace considered his words. Taking a deep breath. She knew she was about to make the hardest decision of her life. The weight of the dilemma was clear in her eyes. Hope also shone there. As if for the first time she saw a way out of her troubles. She looked at him. If this will save my dream, then yes. I agree. Dylan felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. He had found the solution. Now, the plan could begin to unfold. The next afternoon, Dylan and Grace met in his office. It was a luxurious space with huge windows offering an impressive view of the city. Grace felt out of place there. Determined to save his dream, Dylan agreed to the terms. He felt a wave of satisfaction. Now the plan could begin to unfold. The next afternoon, Dylan and Grace met in his office. The office was luxurious and had huge windows with an impressive view of the city. Grace felt out of place there. Her discomfort was obvious. She looked around, absorbing the sophisticated environment she wasn't used to. Dylan, on the other hand, was in his element. He approached the desk where a neatly arranged contract with several pages lay. Without hesitation, he pointed to the document. This is the formal agreement, he explained. Determined to save his dream, Dylan agreed. He felt a wave of satisfaction. The solution was found. The plan could begin to unfold. Dylan and Grace met the next afternoon in his office. A luxurious space with huge windows offering an impressive view of the city. Grace felt out of place there. Her voice was calm, almost cold. It covered all our needs, a temporary marriage. No emotional involvement. Significant financial compensation for you. Once the will's clause is fulfilled, you'll be free to go your own way. Grace looked at the contract. Hesitant. What exactly do I need to do? We'll officially marry at the courthouse and... Determined to save her dream, she agreed. Dylan felt a wave of satisfaction. He had found the solution. Now, the plan could begin to unfold. The next afternoon, Dylan and Grace met in his office. It was a luxurious space with huge windows offering an impressive view of the city. Grace felt out of place there. For all intents and purposes, we'll be husband and wife. Only in the eyes of others, he explained. Trying to simplify as much as possible. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type pizza in the comments. Only those who get this far will understand. Now, let's continue with the story, she nodded. Still looking closely at the contract and worried. The situation felt strange. She was determined to save the cafe. With a deep breath, she picked up the pen and signed her name on the paper. Dylan smiled slightly. Satisfied. Great. With this, we've made our agreement official. They prepared for the civil wedding. Determined to save her dream, Grace agreed. Dylan felt satisfied. He had found the solution. Now, the plan could begin to unfold. The next afternoon, Grace and Dylan met in his office. The office was luxurious and had huge windows with an impressive view of the city. Grace felt out of place there. The wedding was scheduled for the next day. Grace could hardly believe what she was about to do. It was hard to accept that she was marrying for a contract. Something so far from the values she grew up with. But she needed to move forward. The cafe meant everything to her. This was her chance to start over. On the day of the civil wedding. Determined to save her dream. Grace agreed. Dylan felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. He had found the solution. The next afternoon, Dylan and Grace met in his office. The office was luxurious and had huge windows with an impressive view of the city. Grace felt out of place there. She wore a simple dress, while Dylan wore an impeccable suit. The contrast between them was striking. To strangers, they made an interesting couple. During the ceremony, they maintained a professional demeanor, with no exchanged glances or romantic words. When the judge declared them officially married, they only shook hands. Determined to save her dream, Grace nodded her agreement. Dylan felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. He had found the solution. The next afternoon, Dylan and Grace met in his office. It was a luxurious space with huge windows offering an impressive view of the city. Grace felt out of place there. A quick, formal gesture. His grandfather, who was present at the ceremony, found his grandson's coldness a bit odd. After the ceremony, Dylan suggested they go to a restaurant to celebrate discreetly, just to keep up appearances. Grace agreed, still trying to get used to the idea of being the wife of someone she barely knew. During dinner, as they sat down, Grace finally spoke to break the silence. "So now we're officially married," she said, smiling. "Exactly. Because of that, we're one step closer to our goal." She nodded, smiling even though she tried to be practical. It was hard to ignore the strange feeling of being married to Dylan. She had only known Dylan for a short time. He seemed to sense her discomfort. He decided to change the subject. "Why did you decide to open a cafe?" he asked. Curious. Grace relaxed a bit and answered with a slight sparkle in her eyes. "It's always been a dream of mine. I wanted a place where people could come and feel welcome. Something simple. Special." Dylan noticed the enthusiasm in her voice. It was something he rarely saw, passion. Deep down, it intrigued him. He, who always focused on numbers and results, was facing someone who valued a small but significant dream. And, without knowing exactly why, it sparked a strange feeling in him. Determined to save his dream, Dylan agreed. He felt a wave of satisfaction. Now, he could start to put his plan into action. The next afternoon, Dylan and Grace met in his office. It was a luxurious space with huge windows offering an impressive view of the city. Grace felt out of place there. "It's good to have something to fight for," he commented thoughtfully. Grace smiled back. Maybe for the first time without the formality imposed by the contract. "I guess now we both have something to fight for. Don't we?" he asked, still looking at her. The first time. It felt like this wasn't just a cold, calculated deal. There was something more to their relationship. Maybe without realizing it, they were both involved in something that went beyond the simple contract. With dinner finished, they left the restaurant side by side. Dylan offered her a ride. As he drove, he realized his life had just taken a turn he never anticipated. Looking at Grace, he knew this temporary union might have consequences that neither of them could yet imagine. That week, Grace tried to adapt to the unusual routine of being married to Dylan Langford. The visits to events and meetings were intense. To Dylan, they all seemed like strategic commitments. They were opportunities to ensure the world believed in their marriage. Grace, on the other hand, had a hard time feeling comfortable. At every dinner and cocktail party with Dylan, she felt out of place in the world of luxury and appearances. The following days brought an increasingly intense and unexpected routine for Grace and Dylan. Meetings and events increased. Grace's constant presence by her side became something familiar to him. Even as he tried to focus on the initial goal, but for Grace, the closeness with Dylan only heightened her internal dilemma. One morning, as they were preparing for an important meeting with investors at Dylan's company headquarters, Grace observed the environment with she felt a mix of fascination and discomfort. She thought about how he had built that empire, driven by a determination and coldness she never possessed. "Have you always been this dedicated to work?" she asked casually as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. Dylan looked at her through the reflection, surprised by the question. "Always. For me, work is everything." He hesitated, choosing his words. "My grandfather always taught me to be independent and to rely on no one. So far it's worked." Grace smiled slightly. "I think life should be more than that. Right? More than contracts and business meetings." Dylan didn't respond immediately. He felt a certain pressure in his chest. Whenever Grace spoke of her values, it made him reflect more than he liked. He felt a conflict growing within him. He wanted to understand her perspectives. He also feared it would distract him from the main plan. The meeting. Grace surprised Dylan again. Despite her little experience in the corporate world, her genuine presence and natural way of dealing with people captivated the investors, who didn't expect such authenticity in a formal environment without knowing it. Grace was showing Dylan that there were other ways to connect and lead in a more human way he had never considered. Later that same day, as they were heading back to "For me, work is everything," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "My grandfather always taught me to be independent and to rely on no one. So far it's worked." Grace smiled slightly. "I think life should be more than that. Right? More than contracts and business meetings." Dylan didn't respond immediately. He felt a certain pressure in his chest. The office. Dylan noticed that Grace seemed distant, lost in thought, as if something was weighing on her mind. "What's wrong?" he asked, curious. She sighed, looking out the car window. "Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing. You know, with this agreement between us. I mean, I needed the money. I'm not sure I can see myself in this." Dylan didn't respond right away. He felt uneasy, uncomfortable with how honest Grace was being. He knew Grace had reasons to feel this way. He wasn't ready to deal with the feelings her words stirred in him. "You agreed to the contract, knowing what it meant," he replied, trying to keep a "Work is everything to me." He thought about what to say. "My grandfather always taught me to be independent and to rely on no one. So far it's worked." Grace smiled slightly. "I think life should be more than that. Right? More than contracts and business meetings." Dylan didn't respond immediately. He felt a certain pressure in his chest. Practical tone. It was a conscious choice. Grace nodded. Her expression remained somber. "Yes. I know. It's just that now it doesn't seem so simple. It's strange to fake something that in part feels so real." Dylan didn't have an answer for that. He knew the contract was temporary and that Grace wouldn't be around forever. But hearing her he felt uneasy for the first time. He wondered if this fake marriage might have become more than just a temporary alliance for him. 2. That night. After dropping her off at home, Dylan found himself thinking about Grace's words. He, who had always believed in coldness and objectivity, began to feel differently. For me, work is everything. He thought for a moment before responding. My grandfather always taught me to be independent and to rely on no one. So far it's worked. Grace smiled slightly. I think life should be more than that. Right? More than contracts and business meetings. Dylan didn't respond immediately. He felt a certain pressure in his chest, questioning his own beliefs. The world he had always controlled so well seemed, little by little, to be affected by her presence. As he looked out at the view from his luxurious apartment, a doubt tormented him. Was it possible that this agreement was more than just a transaction? Dylan and Grace continued to fulfill the agreement. For me, work is everything. He thought about what to say. My grandfather always taught me to be independent and to rely on no one. So far it's worked. Grace smiled slightly. I think life should be more than that. Right. More than contracts and business meetings. Dylan didn't respond immediately. He felt a certain pressure in his chest. Something in their relationship had changed. To all appearances, they were a couple attending events and dinners. Grace was increasingly present in Dylan's daily life. Over time, she began to explore the more human and less calculating side of the millionaire, sparking a curiosity in him that he couldn't ignore. One weekend, he invited her to spend the day at one of his seaside properties. Even though that wasn't part of the agreement. He said that, as a married couple, they needed to create a convincing image. Even for their closest friends and family, Grace accepted. She felt uneasy. She knew she was getting more involved than she wanted. Should I? When they arrived at the beach house, Grace was enchanted by the scenery. It was a beautiful and private place with a stunning view of the ocean. It was the kind of setting she had never imagined experiencing up close. She found herself lost in the surrounding beauty, letting out a genuine, light, serene smile. Dylan watched her. He was surprised by how intense the moment was. He was used to luxury and expensive properties. For the first time, he realized that they didn't mean as much without someone to share them with. Grace made that environment seem new and fresh. She made everything around her seem more alive. Do you ever get tired of capturing that moment with a sense of intensity that surprised him? He was used to luxury and expensive properties. For the first time, he realized it didn't mean as much without someone to share it with. Grace made that environment seem new and fresh, bringing a feeling that everything around gained more life. Do you never get tired of a place like this? She asked, still admiring the view. It's so surreal. To be honest, it's been a long time since I've stopped to enjoy this place. He replied, crossing his arms while looking at the sea. Usually, I'm always thinking about the next step. The next deal. Grace looked at him with curiosity. Sometimes, I think you forget to live. This place is so surreal. I haven't stopped to enjoy it for a long time. He replied, crossing his arms while looking at the sea. Usually, I'm always thinking about the next step. The next deal. Grace looked at him with curiosity. Sometimes, I think you forget to live. Dylan let out a brief laugh. A rare sound from him. What does that mean to you, Grace? She smiled thoughtfully. To me, living is enjoying moments like this. Valuing what we have now and the people around us. I've never had a lot of money. I've always had my dreams and the people I love close by. That's enough. He watched her. Dylan let out a short laugh, which was unusual for him. What does that mean to you? Grace asked, smiling and thinking. To me, living is enjoying moments like this. Appreciating what we have now and the people around us. I've never had a lot of money. I've always had my dreams and the people I love close by. That's enough. He watched her, fascinated by her simplicity and sincerity. Grace had a way of seeing the world that was the opposite of everything he knew. Her perspective seemed to slowly envelop him in a world he had never explored. After a while of not saying anything, Dylan invited her for a walk on the beach, where they talked about their lives, their dreams, even about. Fascinated by her simplicity and sincerity. Grace's perspective was the opposite of everything he knew. After a while, in silence, Dylan invited her for a walk on the beach where they talked about their lives, their dreams, even about the past. Grace shared stories of her childhood and the challenges of opening the cafe, while he found himself revealing small fragments of his life. Things he had never thought important to share with anyone. During the walk, Dylan felt surprisingly comfortable next to her. The conversation flowed naturally. Without pressures. Without contracts or obligations. It was just him and Grace. Two people seemingly so different. With a connection that seemed to have strengthened without them realizing it. Later, as they returned home, the silence between them felt different. Almost heavy with attention. Neither seemed to know how to resolve the situation. Grace sat on the couch. He looked at Dylan. His face showed a mix of emotions he couldn't identify. There was curiosity, tenderness, maybe a bit of insecurity. You're not as cold as you seem, she said, breaking the silence. He smiled slightly, surprised by her comment. What does that mean? He asked. It means you hide behind this distant and calculated exterior. There's more to you than that. I can see it. Grace hesitated, as if afraid she was crossing the line. Even though this is a contract. I think I'm starting to like seeing the side of you that even you don't seem to know. Dylan was at a loss for words. Her depth hit him. He felt something he hadn't in a long time. He felt exposed. It made him nervous. He moved closer to her, sitting in a way that made it seem like they were getting too close for comfort. Grace. This between us is temporary, he said to himself. He spoke more to himself than to her. It was as if he needed to remind himself of that truth to stay in control. As he spoke, he realized the words didn't sound as true as they once did. Grace nodded her head, looking at him. I know. Sometimes the temporary can be significant. 2. The silence between them spoke more than any words could. At that moment, Dylan realized that this temporary alliance was transforming everything he thought he knew about love. Connections. Most importantly, about himself. The following week, Dylan and Grace were invited to a charity gala. One of Dylan's biggest business partners was organizing the event. It was a significant occasion, full of influential people, investors, renowned figures. As a couple, they were almost required to be there. Dylan. These events were common. Grace was not used to being in high society. The thought of being around rich and famous people made her nervous. On the night of the gala, Grace wore an elegant dress that Dylan had chosen for her. The simple fabric made her look even more beautiful. As she approached Dylan, ready to leave, he found he couldn't take his eyes off her. She was radiant and natural, her presence stood out in any setting without even trying. "You look beautiful," he said in an almost inaudible tone. Surprising himself, Grace smiled shyly as he offered her his arm. On the way to the event, she was visibly uneasy, trying to control her anxiety. Noticing this, Dylan tried to reassure her. "Remember, we're in this together. Just be yourself." Grace nodded, trying to calm down. She knew that being with Dylan helped her face her fear of being in such a fancy place. At the same time, his closeness made her feel something she was trying to avoid. No matter how hard she tried to keep the situation under control. As time went on, she found herself attracted to him. Especially now that she knew him better. When they arrived at the fancy place, Dylan held her hand for a moment. It was a silent promise that he was with her. That simple act of support, though meant to keep up appearances, made Grace's heart beat faster. They entered the gala together. Grace tried to enjoy the atmosphere, smiling at people's curious glances and greetings. During the night, Dylan introduced her to his colleagues and business partners. Grace was surprised at how much she enjoyed hearing about Dylan's professional life, which he had always kept separate from his personal life. He was now sharing with her, even if only to make it seem like they were still married. Over time, she started to feel more confident and relaxed. She even started to enjoy the evening. At one point, while they were talking with one of Dylan's long as time went on, she felt more and more at ease, even enjoying the evening. At one point, while they were talking with one of Dylan's long-time investors, Grace noticed a change in his expression. She had learned to interpret a stiffness in his body as tension. The man, Mr. Barnes, was a close friend of George's. When he spoke about Dylan's grandfather, he gave the young businessman a direct look. "Old George always had a big dream for you, Dylan. He wanted you to find someone who truly valued you. Someone who would make you rethink your priorities," Barnes said, with a shrewd glance towards Grace. "And I must say, seeing you finally married to someone so charming is a great relief." Dylan forced a smile. "Thank you," he said. He seemed upset. Grace noticed that he was nervous. She squeezed his hand to show that she was there for him. Barnes smiled and walked away to talk with other guests. Dylan sighed when they were alone. He felt relieved. Also uncomfortable. "It's strange how everyone seems to have an opinion about my life," he said. "I know," Grace said. "But they just want the best for you. Your grandfather and Mr. Barnes. They really care." Dylan looked at her. For the first time, Grace saw vulnerability in his eyes. "My grandfather always thought I was incomplete because of how I viewed life and relationships. He used to say that success without someone to share it with is just emptiness." Grace stayed silent, thinking about what he said. She never imagined that someone like Dylan, who seemed to have it all, could feel such a deep void. Suddenly, she realized he might be struggling with something bigger than she had imagined. As the two moved in the quiet corner of the room, Grace felt like saying something to make him feel better. She finally said quietly, "Maybe he just wants you to be happy." Dylan looked at her. He could tell that she was sincere. He had always been cold. Grace seemed to understand him. She saw the man behind the businessman. She saw that he was lonely. This made him feel a connection that he hadn't felt before. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly, not looking away. There was clear tension between them. At that moment, the contract that bound them seemed to disappear into something more complicated. It was something both were starting to understand. They were also afraid to admit. In that room full of important people, Dylan and Grace were finally alone with each other. Neither one said a word. Both felt that their fake marriage was becoming more than just an agreement. The question hanging in the air was simple but unsettling: how far would this go? After the gala, the relationship between Dylan and Grace changed without them saying anything. It was clear that they were more committed to each other than before. They didn't want to admit it. They couldn't ignore it. Grace noticed that Dylan was struggling with his emotions. He seemed to be losing his usual control. Then, one quiet afternoon, Dylan got a call from his grandfather's caretaker. He told Dylan that George was back in the hospital. The caretaker's urgent voice made Dylan nervous. He remembered a fear he had tried to forget. He was afraid of losing the one person he trusted the most. Dylan wanted to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. He hesitated for a moment before asking Grace to go with him. "I think my grandfather would be happy to see you. He has always been the biggest supporter of this marriage," he said in a quiet, hesitant tone, as if he didn't want to reveal how much those words truly meant. Grace nodded, sensing Dylan's tension. During the drive to the hospital, the silence between them was obvious. They were both feeling things they didn't say. Dylan was lost in thought. Grace noticed that his connection with his grandfather was stronger than he let on when she looked at him from the side. When they arrived at the hospital, Dylan guided her through the hallways to George's room. The soft light from the windows filled the room. The elderly man slowly opened his eyes when he heard their footsteps. Seeing them together made George happy. He smiled, even though he was weak. "My favorite couple," he said in a good. Dylan was amused, even though his voice was weaker than before. Grace went to the bed and gently held George's hand. She felt how fragile he was. Also how strong he was. As if he understood more than anyone there. Looking at the old man, she realized the love he felt for Dylan went far beyond the desire to leave his. He was lucky. He really wanted his grandson to experience true love. Dylan tried to stay calm. His grandfather looked at him with concern. "You seem nervous, son. Is everything okay?" George asked gently, breaking down any defense Dylan might have had. Dylan hesitated but replied with a tired sigh. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not the grandson you wanted me to be. Like I'm failing somehow." George looked at Dylan with more kindness in his eyes. He held Dylan's hand tightly. "All I ever wanted was for you to find someone who could show you what really matters. I pushed for this marriage because I thought it might give you something more than just business or money." George's words hit Dylan hard. She felt a warm, unexpected sense of ease. Before, she thought the contract was just a formality. Now she realized that George saw something much bigger. He wanted Dylan to experience true love and finally understand the value of sharing his life with someone. Dylan lowered his head for a moment, visibly touched. "I never understood your insistence before. I always thought you were stuck in the past." She felt a surge of warmth, unexpected and overwhelming. She had always thought the contract was just a formality, a cold document. Now she understood that George saw something much bigger. He wanted Dylan to experience true love. To finally understand the value of sharing his life with someone. Dylan lowered his head for a moment. Visibly touched. I never understood your insistence before. I always thought you were stuck in old-fashioned ideas, that it was all just sentimentality. He glanced briefly at Grace, who looked away, feeling exposed. Now I'm not so sure anymore. George laughed softly. Sometimes all we need is a chance to see things differently. Grace, he said, looking at her with genuine affection. You brought something I knew Dylan needed. Thank you for that. Grace felt her eyes fill with tears, moved by George's kindness. Along with gratitude, a weight of guilt came over her. George believed the marriage was real to him. There was no doubt that her relationship with Dylan was real. This made her nervous. After a long conversation, Dylan and Grace said their goodbyes to George. The old man watched them leave. His face looked calm, as if he knew the feelings between them were real, even though he didn't want them to be. He didn't know that this feeling was about to change. In the parking lot, as they walked in silence, Grace couldn't hold back her words. Dylan, your grandfather believes in this marriage. He really thinks we're together for real. Dylan stopped and remained silent, feeling the weight of that revelation. I know. It's bothering me. He believes I found what he always wanted for me. Part of me wants to honor that. Another part knows we're living a lie. Grace felt a tightness in her chest, a mix of sadness and anguish. Dylan just wants you to be happy. Maybe. Without realizing it. You're closer to that than you think. Dylan sighed, his gaze distant. This agreement, Grace, it changed something in me. Maybe it changed you, too. He looked at her, his eyes showing confusion and strong feelings. Grace held his gaze. Inside her, she was very worried. She knew the truth had to be told. She was afraid of how George would react. At that moment, she felt that the next time she saw him could be very important. After Dylan and Grace went to the hospital, George started to watch them more closely. Something about their interaction made him doubtful. He knew his grandson. He knew Dylan had always been distant and serious about business. George was sure that the sudden change was not natural. It felt too fake. He decided to look into the marriage that interested him so much. A few days later, he had the results. He was sure that his guesses were right. George learned that the marriage between Dylan and Grace was not real. It was a trick. A plan to make Dylan do what the will wanted and get the family's money. To George, this was more than just a lie. It was a personal betrayal. George had always taught Dylan to be honest and good. He never thought his grandson could. George did something so cold and planned. This made him hurt and disappointed. He decided to confront him one last time. Dylan was called to the hospital again. He entered the room with a serious expression. He didn't have the usual slight smile. He saw the icy look on his grandfather's face. George watched him with an air of disappointment that made Dylan's heart tighten. Without saying anything, the old man began. Dylan, he said, his voice firmer than ever. I had your marriage to Grace investigated. Dylan froze, a chill running down his spine. He tried to stay calm. George's words made it clear that his grandfather knew everything. Before Dylan could answer, George continued, how could you do this to me? The pain in his voice was clear. I always wanted you to find someone who made you happy. Someone who showed you that life isn't just about numbers and contracts. The only reason for that clause was to see my grandson become a more humane, happier person. But instead, you deceived me. Made me believe this marriage was real. Dylan lowered his head. His head lowered as he met his grandfather's gaze. He felt ashamed and knew that. The first time. There was no escaping this situation. He had betrayed the trust of the only family member who truly cared about him. I only did it because I needed the inheritance to keep the company projects going. Grandpa's voice shook as he spoke. I thought that was what mattered most to you. Important. George shook his head. Disappointed. What I wanted, Dylan, was to see you live. To see you love and be loved. You've always been a solitary, closed man. I just wanted you to know that there's more to life than work and money. You lied to me. That was wrong. Dylan felt the impact of that. Dylan felt terrible. He knew that his grandfather really cared about more than just the money. George took a deep breath, trying not to cry. Of Dylan. George said, I'm sorry. You won't get the money. I want it to go to a cause that truly matters. The words hit him like a knife in the heart. He never imagined that the inheritance meant so much to his grandfather. It wasn't about money. Something much deeper. George took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. Because of this, Dylan, you won't receive the inheritance. I'd rather it go to causes that truly promote human value. Someone who did what you did doesn't deserve our family's legacy. Dylan remained silent, unable to protest. He knew that nothing he said would change George's decision. Deep down, he knew he deserved this consequence. That same night, leaving the hospital, Dylan went straight to Grace's apartment. He knocked on the door. Human value. Someone who did what you did doesn't deserve our family's legacy. Dylan remained silent, unable to protest. He knew that nothing he said would change George's decision. Deep down, he knew he deserved this consequence. That same night, leaving the hospital, Dylan went straight to Grace's apartment. He knocked on the door with a heavy heart, unable to control himself. When she opened it, she immediately saw the tension on his face. What happened? Dylan, she asked. Her voice worried. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. Grace. Our contract is over, he said. She looked at him, confused. What do you mean? My grandfather found out everything. He knows the whole story. He felt heavy-hearted. She saw the tension on his face when she opened it. What happened? Dylan, she asked. Her voice worried. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. Grace. Our contract is over, she said. Looking at him, confused. What do you mean? My grandfather found out everything. He knows the marriage was a sham. We did it to fulfill the clause and secure the inheritance. And now he's decided I won't get anything. He explained, each word hitting like a blow. Grace swallowed hard, not knowing what to say. Dylan looked at her with a bitter expression. There was something else. Something that felt like a goodbye. I'll honor what I promised, that you'll get the money for the cafe, you don't have to worry. He said in a distant, almost mechanical tone, now that the deal is over. We don't need to pretend anymore. Grace felt a tightness in her chest as if those words were cutting something she wanted to preserve. Even knowing it all started as "I'll honor what I promised. You'll get the money for the cafe. You don't have to worry." He said these words in a distant, almost mechanical tone. "Now that the deal is over. We don't need to pretend anymore." Grace felt a tightness in her chest as if those words were cutting something she wanted to preserve. Even though she knew it all started as a contract, she didn't expect it to end so coldly. As if nothing they lived through had truly meant anything. "So that's it," she murmured, her voice trembling. "That's all?" Dylan looked away, trying to hide the pain in his eyes. "Yes. Grace. The contract is over. You can go on with your life. And I'll go on with mine." Grace stood still, trying to. "I'll honor what I promised. You'll get the money for the cafe. You don't have to worry." He said this in a distant, almost mechanical tone. "Now that the deal is over. We don't need to pretend anymore." Grace felt a tightness in her chest. Those words felt like a knife cutting something she wanted to preserve. She knew it all started as a process. Finally, she just nodded, stepping back and closing the door without looking back. So the marriage that had been a lie ended the same way it began, with a cold and impersonal agreement. The following days for Dylan were lonely. He tried to return to his routine, diving into company projects. Nothing seemed to matter. "I'll honor what I promised. You'll get the money for the cafe. You don't have to worry." He said this in a distant, almost mechanical tone. "Now that the deal is over. We don't need to pretend anymore." Grace felt a tightness in her chest. Those words felt like a cut. Even though she knew it all started as before. There was a constant absence. A void he couldn't fill no matter how much he worked. He missed Grace. He missed their conversations. The quiet smiles. The silent glances they exchanged without anyone noticing. The emptiness in his life was overwhelming. Gradually, he realized it wasn't the inheritance he had lost. It was her. Grace. The memories of the moments they shared haunted him, making him question everything he believed in. He tried to convince himself that the feeling would pass. That it was just a phase. The more days went by, the more he found himself captive to an inescapable truth: he had fallen in love with her. Now he couldn't live without her. Was alone. As he watched the city skyline from his office window, Dylan realized that all the money and power he had accumulated over the years held no value. The real loss he felt was Grace. The empty life he now tried to fill seemed heavier than any legacy. Dylan Langford, the man who had always lived for work, now faced the "I'll keep my promise. You'll get the money for the cafe. Don't worry." He said these words in a distant, almost mechanical tone. "Now that the deal is over. We don't need to pretend anymore." Grace felt a tightness in her chest. As if those words were cutting something she wanted to preserve. Even though she knew it all started as a harsh reality that without the love he had discovered with Grace, he would never be truly happy. Dylan tried to return to his routine. The void Grace left made everything unbearably monotonous. Every meeting, every decision he made at the company. His mind drifted back to the moments he spent with her. The memories came unexpectedly. "I'll honor what I promised. You'll get the money for the cafe. You don't have to worry." He said this in a distant, almost mechanical tone. "Now that the deal is over. We don't need to pretend anymore." Grace felt a tightness in her chest. As if those words were cutting something she wanted to preserve. Even though she knew it all started as a smile. A conversation. Her gentle touch when he needed it most. One day, exhausted from fighting his feelings, Dylan closed his laptop and left the office early. He drove aimlessly, trying to find a way to fill the void. All he could do was remember his grandfather's words. George didn't want a wealthy and successful grandson. He wanted to see him happy. To see him truly connected to someone. Dylan had failed. Though. He gave up the only thing that made him feel alive. As he drove, he made a decision. He knew he needed to win Grace back. Not because of the contract. Because he genuinely wanted her. He loved her. At that moment, he turned around and headed to Grace's cafe. The sign was still lit at the entrance. Inside, the tables were empty and Grace was sitting alone at the counter, looking through a ledger. When she saw him, her eyes widened. She looked surprised and confused. Dylan, her voice trembled slightly. What are you? I'll honor what I promised. You'll get the money for the cafe. You don't have to worry. He spoke in a distant, almost mechanical tone. Now that the deal is over, we don't need to pretend anymore. Grace felt a tightness in her chest. As if those words were cutting something she wanted to preserve. Even knowing it all started as a. He took a deep breath, trying to organize everything he wanted to say. Grace. I know it might be too late. I need to tell you, everything has changed for me. Grace looked away, clearly cautious. Dylan. We both know this all started as a lie. You wanted the inheritance. I just wanted to save the cafe. I know, he said. I'll keep my promise. You'll get the money for the cafe. You don't have to worry. He said these words in a distant, almost mechanical tone. Now that the deal is over, we don't need to pretend anymore. Grace felt a tightness in her chest. As if those words were cutting something she wanted to preserve. Even though she knew it all started as a. His voice was filled with emotion. In the middle of all this lying, I found something real. I found you. Even though I started this as a contract, I now know that what I feel for you is real. Grace looked at him in silence. Her heart torn between hurt and hope. What makes you think we can just forget everything and start over? Dylan understood the weight of her question. He knew that winning her back would be difficult. He also knew that he couldn't give up. I'm not asking you to forget about Grace. I'm asking for a second chance. I was wrong. I lied. I also learned. My grandfather was right. He wanted me to change to understand the value of true connections. You're the only one who showed me the importance of true connections. Grace kept her eyes fixed on Dylan. Still hesitant. You hurt me. Dylan. I was starting to believe that maybe all of it was real. He took her hands and his. I don't know if I can undo what I did. I can change what we are now. I want to be by your side to support you. Grace kept her eyes fixed on him. Still hesitant. You hurt me. Dylan. I was starting to believe that maybe all of it was real. He stepped forward, taking her hands and his. I don't know if I can undo what I did. I can change what we are now. I want to be by your side to support your dreams. I want to be part of your life. Not as a contract. As a man who's completely in love with you. Grace felt tears forming. She stayed calm. His words seemed sincere. Finally, she saw the man she always knew he could be. Dylan, she murmured. Emotional. I just wanted something real. He smiled. His eyes shining with the promise, dreams to be part of your life. Not as a contract. As a man who's completely in love with you. Grace felt tears forming. She stayed calm. His words seemed sincere. Finally. She saw the man she always knew he could be, Dylan. I just wanted something real, she murmured. Emotional. I want that too. If you give me a chance. I promise everything will be different. I just want to make you happy. Grace took a deep breath. Feeling the weight of the choice. But as she looked at him, she realized that the man in front of her was different from the one she had known. He was willing to let go of control. To show vulnerability. To value the connection they had created, finally. She nodded. Letting hope blossom again. Okay. Dylan. Let's start over. This time. No lies. Dylan smiled. Pulling her into a tight hug. Feeling like the emptiness in his heart was finally complete, and at that moment, they knew they were ready to. Dylan took control. Showing his vulnerability and valuing their connection. Finally. She nodded. Letting hope blossom again. Okay. Dylan. Let's start over. This time. No lies. Dylan smiled. Pulling her into a tight hug. He felt like the emptiness in his heart was finally complete. At that moment, they knew they were ready to build a new story, a real story without contracts or clauses. With the commitment to be happy together. Months had passed since Dylan and Grace decided to start a new life together. Since then, he felt the transformation in every detail of his daily life. Her presence brought new meaning to everything. It was a happiness he demonstrated control. Revealing his vulnerability and the value of their connection. Finally. She nodded. Allowing hope to flourish anew. Okay. Dylan. Let's start over. This time. No lies. Dylan smiled. Embracing her in a tight hug. He felt like the emptiness in his heart was finally complete. And at that moment, they knew they were ready to experience the unknown. As the days went by, Dylan's certainty grew. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. On a quiet night, while having dinner in Grace's cozy apartment, Dylan felt the perfect moment approaching. He held her hand and looked into her eyes with such intensity that Grace held her breath. Grace. He began. His voice soft but full of emotion, since you came into my life. Everything has changed. I thought I had everything. I found out I had nothing until I met you. You showed me what it is to truly live. I can't imagine my life without you. Grace smiled. Her eyes were shining with tears. She knew every word he said was sincere because she felt the same. Dylan. She said. Smiling. He pulled a small box from his coat pocket. Grace Evans. He said, will you marry me? Not for a contract. Not for convenience. For love. Everything we've built together. Grace brought her hands to her mouth. Surprised and emotional, the sight of the ring shining in the little box and the look of love in Dylan's eyes made her heart overflow with happiness, with tears streaming down her face. She nodded. Barely able to contain her emotion. Yes. Dylan. I accept with all my heart. She replied. Letting herself be enveloped in his embrace as he spun her around. Both laughing and crying at. Dylan smiled. The same time. He felt nervous. In the days that followed, Dylan knew there was someone very important who needed to hear the news. His grandfather, George, was still recovering. He was at home, enjoying the comfort of being back. Dylan drove to his grandfather's house, determined to share everything. He had Grace's ring in his pocket. When he arrived, he found George sitting on the porch looking at the garden with a calm expression. The old man smiled as he saw his grandson approaching. He soon noticed the seriousness on Dylan's face and stayed silent, waiting for him to speak. "Grandpa." Dylan began with a softer and more respectful tone than ever before. "That I had to come here to tell you what happened. Also to ask for your forgiveness." George raised an eyebrow but kept a gentle look. "Forgiveness? My boy, for what?" Dylan took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the moment. "That I know that at the beginning I failed you. That marriage with Grace was a lie. A cold agreement so I could get the inheritance. I was blinded by ambition, thinking that was what mattered. You were right. I needed someone by my side. Someone to show me what truly living means." George remained silent. There was an emotional expression in his eyes. He continued to listen, giving Dylan the space to open up. "I fell in love with her, Grandpa." George took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with tears. He had dreamed of this moment. The day his grandson would understand that the true legacy of life isn't money. The love and connections we create. Dylan, George began, his voice filled with emotion. "Nothing in the world could make me happier than knowing that you found someone like Grace." "Okay, Dylan. Let's start over. This time, no lies." Dylan smiled, pulling her into a tight hug. "I feel like the emptiness in my heart is finally complete." At that moment, they knew they were ready to truly be together. "I can't imagine my life without Grace. You made me realize that what I sought in the inheritance had no value without someone to share life, dreams, achievements with. And that person is her. I just wanted you to know that Grace and I are getting married for real. I really want to see you there." He took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with tears. He had dreamed of this moment. The day his grandson would understand that the true legacy of life isn't money. The love and connections we create. "Dylan," George began, his voice filled with emotion. "Nothing in the world could make me happier than knowing that you found someone like Grace." Dylan felt a surge of emotion as he approached his grandfather, grasping his hands and confessing. "I'm sorry for lying to you. I thought I was being smart. I was actually lost. You always wanted the best for me. Now I understand what that means." George pulled him into a tight hug, a rare gesture between them. At that moment, it felt like the only way to express their feelings. "What matters is that you found your way. Grace is a wonderful woman. I know you will be very happy together. I'd be honored to be there at the wedding, seeing you take the step this time with your heart." Dylan smiled, relieved, felt the weight of his wrong choices finally lift. He had spent so much time building a life based on material values. Now, with Grace and his grandfather's support, he felt complete for the first time. As he said goodbye, Dylan felt grateful and in love. He knew he was about to start a new chapter of his life with Grace. A life based on truth and sincerity. As he left, he heard his grandfather whisper something in his ear. "Remember, my boy, the most important legacy is the one you build with love. That's the only one that lasts." With those words in mind, Dylan left with a smile, eager to begin his life with Grace. This time, what united them was the purest and deepest truth. The big day finally arrived. Dylan woke up that morning with a mix of anxiety, joy, deep peace. He and Grace would be united. Not by a contract. By a genuine commitment. A choice of love. Grace was in the preparation room, surrounded by friends and family who shared her happiness. She looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting. With trembling hands, she held her veil, still amazed by what was about to happen. It was hard to believe that this union, which started as a front, had become so deep and real. This wedding was everything she never imagined she would have, a celebration of love and a true beginning with the man she had learned to love. Outside, the guests were starting to take their seats. George was there. Sitting in the front row with a calm and emotional, she held her veil with shaking hands, still amazed by what was about to happen. This union, which started as a front, had grown into something so deep and real. This wedding was everything she never imagined she would have, a celebration of love and a true beginning with the man she had learned to love. Outside, the guests were beginning to take their seats. George was there, sitting in the front row with a calm and emotional look. He no longer had the same strength as before. Nothing would stop him from being there to witness his grandson's wedding. With every smile and greeting he received, he responded with an expression of pride and contentment, knowing that his vision for Dylan's future was becoming even more beautiful than he had imagined. When the music started, Dylan took his place at the altar, his heart racing. He kept his eyes fixed on the entrance of the she held her veil with shaking hands, amazed at what was about to happen. This union, which started as a front, had grown into something so deep and real. This wedding was everything she never imagined she would have, a celebration of love and a true beginning with the man she had learned to love. Outside, the guests were starting to take their seats. George was there, sitting in the front row with a calm and emotional. The church eagerly waited for the moment he would see Grace. Then she appeared, shining and walking slowly toward him, her eyes shining with emotion. Each step she took was like a reminder of everything they had been through and every obstacle they had overcome to be together. When they met at the altar, Dylan held Grace's hand, smiling in a way that revealed the depth of his feelings. It was a mix of gratitude, love, respect for everything she meant. She held her veil with shaking hands, still amazed by what was about to happen. This union, which started as a front, had evolved into something so deep and real. This wedding was everything she never imagined she would have, a celebration of love, a true beginning with the man she had learned to love. Outside, the guests were beginning to take their seats. George was there, sitting in the front row with a calm and emotional. To him, Grace returned the smile, feeling completely secure by his side. The officiant began the ceremony. For Dylan and Grace, the world around them seemed to disappear. It was as if they were in their own universe, where every word and every glance carried the weight of everything they had learned together. When it was time for the vows, Dylan looked into Grace's eyes and began, his voice trembling with emotion. Grace, when we met, I was a closed. George was sitting in the front row, looking calm but also controlled by his work. You showed me a side of life I had never explored before. A side full of love, laughter, moments that I now know are the most important. You brought a meaning to my life that I never imagined. Today I promise to love you with all that I am. I promise to be your partner and support you. To make every day by your side a conscious and true choice. You are my life. My joy. I am eternally grateful to have found you. Grace held back tears. Moved when it was her turn. She took a deep breath. Letting the love she felt for him guide her words. Dylan. You entered my life in an unexpected way. From the beginning you showed me a world I never imagined living in. That I have learned from you the importance of being true. Of seeking what really matters. She held her veil with shaking hands. Amazed at what was about to happen. This union, which started as a front, had evolved into something deep and real. This wedding was everything she never imagined she would have, a celebration of love and a genuine beginning with the man she had learned to love. Outside, the guests were beginning to take their seats. George was there, sitting in the front row with a calm and emotional. Never giving up on those we love. Today, I promise to love you without reservation. To be by your side in all moments. To build with you a life full of love. Companionship. Happiness. You are the love I have always dreamed of. I know that together, we will be stronger than we could ever be alone. The officiant declared them husband and wife. As they sealed their commitment with a kiss, she held her veil with shaking hands. Amazed at what was about to happen. This union, which started as a front, had grown into something so deep and real. This wedding was everything she never imagined she would have, a celebration of love and a true beginning with the man she had learned to love. Outside, the guests were beginning to take their seats. George was there, sitting in the front row with a calm and emotional. The hall filled with applause and emotion. George watched the scene with tears in his eyes, knowing that at that moment, the true legacy of the Langford family had been passed on. Not the money. The ability to love and build something real. At the reception, while everyone celebrated, Dylan and Grace danced together. Lost in each other. Feeling that they were finally where they had always belonged. The smiles. Looks. Words between them showed the love that had grown despite the lies and contract. Becoming a true and deep connection. That day, with friends and family around, Dylan and Grace started a new life. Knowing their love, built through challenges, would be the foundation of lasting happiness. George smiled, happy that his mission was finished. He had shown his grandson what truly mattered. Seeing the happiness on Dylan's face made him realize his mission had been successful. He knew that this love was going to last. With the blessing of everyone who loved them, Dylan and Grace started a new journey, a true and eternal marriage. With the promise that from now on, they would always be one. What did you think of Dylan's attitude toward his grandfather? Share your opinion in the comments. How would you rate this story from 0 to 10? Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to stay updated on all our stories. You can also check out more touching stories by clicking here on the final screen.